Question 28 says that the average of a list of four numbers is 90. A new list of four numbers has the same first three numbers as the original list, but the fourth number in the original list is 80, and the fourth number in the new list is 96. What is the average of this new list of numbers? And as answers, we have numbers ranging from 90 all the way to 94.8. And then as far as the ACT math concepts from reading the question, the main thing that's going on here is just this idea of averages. And then in terms of solving this question, there are several different ways of thinking about it. In this video, I'm going to go over a couple of them. One is going to involve using the average formula, and then the other one is a little bit more abstract, which we'll leave until the end. And before we actually go into the solutions here, I just want to make a note that if we're really familiar and comfortable with the average formula, then this is a question that we could do pretty quickly, even in our head or, with some quick calculations. But for a lot of test takers, the way that this question is presented, where there's like this old original list and then a new list and all these numbers, it's a little bit confusing potentially about where to start. So in explaining this, I'm just going to try to model how we could approach a question like this if we're not totally sure where to begin. So a good place to always begin is to ask ourselves, what are the main math concepts involved in this question? And we had already identified that average is the main thing here. And then once we've identified the concept, we want to ask ourselves, what does the ACT expect us to know when it comes to that concept? And in particular for averages, what we're expected to know is the average formula. So I'll write that out over here. Basically, the average of a set of numbers is going to be equal to the sum of those numbers divided by the quantity of the numbers. And now that we have that formula in front of us, I would just take things one step at a time and see what information that we can begin to fill in here. So we were told initially that the average of a list of four numbers is 90. Well, in this formula, we can actually begin to fill parts of that in. The average is 90, so I'll write that 90 is equal to, and we don't know the sum, but we do know the quantity. It's four numbers. So I'm just going to write 90 is equal to the sum divided by 4. And this is for the original list. So I'll just do orig and then list. And the next thing we could ask ourselves is, well, in this formula, what can we actually figure out from that? Well, one thing we could do is multiply both sides by 4. And that would tell us that 4 times 90 is 360. So we'd have that 360 is the sum. And this is of the original list. All right, so now that we've got that information down, let's continue reading this and see what else we can figure out. A new list of four numbers has the same first three numbers as the original list, but the fourth number in the original list is 80, and the fourth number in the new list is 96. What is the average of this new list of numbers? Okay, another helpful thing that we can do on math questions in general, and on this one too, is to focus in on what we're actually trying to find at the end of the day. And here we're trying to get the average of this new list of numbers. And so I'm going to write down at the bottom this thing that we're trying to find, the average of new list of numbers. And we know that to find an average using this average formula, we're going to need the sum and also the quantity. So I'll also write that. The average of new list of numbers, which is what we're trying to find, is going to be equal to the sum of the numbers in the new list divided by the quantity of numbers in the new list. All right, so now that we have all this information down in terms of what we know and what we're trying to find, we're in a very good position to solve the question. We know that to get the final answer, the average of this new list, we need these two other parts, the sum of the numbers in the new list as well as the quantity of numbers in the new list. Well, going back to the question, we're told that a new list of four numbers, so this new list has four numbers as well, so this quantity right here is going to just still be 4. And now the only thing left to find is the sum of the numbers in the new list. Well, we already know that the new list is going to have the same first three numbers as the original list. We don't know what those numbers are, but we know that they're going to be the same. And we also know that the new list is just going to have this last number swapped out. So the original one had an 80. Now we're going to swap it for a 96. Well, to figure out the sum of the new list, we can go back to the sum of the original list because we know that the first three numbers are going to be the same. And then we're just taking out an 80 and we're adding back in a 96. So let's now figure out what the new sum is going to be. So we're going to have 360. That total of the first four numbers. We're going to take out an 80 from that sum, and then we're going to add back in that fourth number, which is a 96. And this is going to be, well, we're basically adding 16 because that's the difference between 80 and 96. And so this is going to be 376. That is going to be the sum of the new list of numbers. So we can now plug that back into this formula, and I'll just rewrite it over here. Average is going to be equal to 376 divided by 4, and I'll pull up the calculator for that. So 376 divided by 4, that gives us 94. So that is our new average, and that is what the question was asking. So the answer is H. And by the way, I want to mention at this point that the first three numbers, we never had to know what they were to figure this question out. We just needed to know basically what the sum of all those numbers was so that we could swap out the 80 and the 96 together. And that can be sort of a sticking point. It can be confusing when we don't actually know what the three numbers are. And I've seen some test takers actually give themselves examples for the three numbers so that with the fourth number, they add up to 360 and have an average of 90. And that approach also works on this question, although I would also recommend being comfortable with using the average formula in the way we did because that can come in handy on other math questions on the ACT. Let's look at a couple of the wrong answers now. Answer choice F of 90 is the average of the original list of numbers, so that could reflect the mistake of assuming that it's just going to stay the same. And then answer choice G of 91.5 could reflect a mistake in assuming that each of the numbers in the original list was 90 and that we were going to swap out one of those 90s with a 96 instead of an 80 with a 96, because if we were to do that and then find the new average, that would lead to 91.5. And then for answer choices J and K, I'm not entirely sure what those were anticipating on this one. I'm going to type out what we ultimately needed to know here mathematically. Needed to know. Essentially, it came down to being comfortable with the average formula and being able to rearrange it. So I'll just write average formula and then how to rearrange it. And finally, as far as ultimate takeaways on this question, one big one, as we saw here, was that it can be helpful if it's unclear how to necessarily start a question or if the information seems a little bit overwhelming at first. Just asking ourselves, what are the math concepts involved here? What does the ACT expect me to know about those math concepts? Immediately writing down any relevant formula, like here, it was the average formula, and then just taking things one step at a time. Filling in what we know into the formula, rearranging it, and then also writing down what we're trying to find at the end. Because once we have all this information in front of us, it's kind of analogous to drawing a picture on some of the other ACT questions that don't give us a picture. It frees up our mental processing power to connect the dots and sort of take what we know and connect it to what we're trying to find. So writing stuff down and taking things one step at a time is a very helpful thing on a lot of ACT math questions. And finally, content-wise, we definitely do want to be familiar with the average formula and also being able to rearrange it to solve for the other values in that formula. For example, sometimes we'll be given the average and the quantity, and we'll need to figure out the sum, or we'll be given the sum and the average and need to figure out the quantity. I'll link to some resources that go into that a little bit more depth. For another example of when the average formula comes in handy on this particular test, you can check out question number 14 since it's also relevant there. All right, so that wraps things up for question 28. Let's go on to 29.